Star Trek is one of the 10 highest-grossing media franchises in human history. 13 films, 12 television series, 60 years, hundreds of billions of dollars. But here is what almost nobody knows. The show that started all of that was rejected, physically cut apart, and nearly destroyed forever. The captain was not Kirk. The first officer was a woman, and the franchise only survived because of a woman who was famous for being funny, not for loving science fiction. Here is the question nobody asks. What if the Star Trek everyone grew up with was actually the backup plan? And what if the real version sat in a rusty, unmarked can in a Hollywood lab for 23 years, 1 week away from being thrown in the trash? The year is 1964. Gene Roddenberry has an idea for a television show. He calls it A Wagon Train to the Stars, space exploration, a crew, a ship called the Enterprise. He writes a pilot episode called The Cage. $630,000 to make. That is a staggering amount of money for a television pilot in 1964. The most expensive pilot Desilu Studios had ever produced, by far. But Roddenberry spent every penny because he believed in what he was making. And what he made was genuinely different. The captain of the Enterprise was not James Kirk. His name was Christopher Pike, played by Jeffrey Hunter. Pike was darker, more conflicted, a man who was tired of command and thinking about quitting. He was not the confident action hero. He was a man with doubts. The first officer was a woman called Number One, played by Majel Barrett, the second most powerful person on the ship. In 1964, on American network television, Spock was there, but he was completely different. Emotional, curious. He smiled. He did not have the cold, logical thing yet. That came later. The weapons were called lasers, not phasers. The tone of the whole show was quieter, slower, darker, less action, more ideas. Less cowboys in space, more Twilight Zone in space. Roddenberry had something real, something genuinely ahead of its time. The cast loved it. Everyone who saw it at the studio loved it. Then NBC watched it in February 1965. And here is where you expect me to say they hated it. But that is not quite what happened, and that is what makes this story stranger than most people realize. NBC did not hate The Cage. They said in writing that they were fascinated by the concept, impressed by the production, genuinely interested in the show. But they said 3 words about the pilot itself: too cerebral, too intellectual, too slow. Their exact note to Roddenberry said the show would go over the heads of most viewers, that it required too much thought to follow, that audiences in 1965 were not ready for a science fiction show built around ideas instead of action. They wanted a right cross to the jaw at the end. That is an actual quote from inside the production. The network wanted a fistfight finale. The Cage ended with something more complicated than that, so they rejected the pilot. But here is the extraordinary part. They did not cancel the show. NBC did something that almost never happened in television. They rejected the pilot and commissioned a second one. Try again, they said. Same show, different approach, more action, simpler story, faster pace. This is unheard of. Networks do not pay twice for the same show. They gave Roddenberry a second chance because they believed there was something worth saving, even if he had built it in the wrong direction the first time. And that second chance is how you got Kirk, how you got Uhura, how you got Bones, how you got everything. But the first version, The Cage, the real one Roddenberry actually wanted to make, that one disappeared. And the way it disappeared is one of the most painful accidents in television history. Before we get to what happened to The Cage, I want to ask you something. The Cage is available to watch now. You can find it online, and people who watch it say it is genuinely great, dark, smart, different. So, here is the question. Is the Star Trek we got better than the Star Trek that the cage was setting up? Drop your answer in the comments, because I think people are seriously split on this one. Star Trek got picked up. Second pilot, William Shatner as Kirk. The show we all know. It went to air in September 1966 and became a cultural phenomenon. But behind the scenes, the first season was a disaster to produce. The visual effects took forever. Episodes were constantly running late. The network was breathing down everyone's neck to deliver. So, Roddenberry had an idea. He would write a two-part story that used footage from the cage as flashback sequences. Less new footage to shoot, less effects work, cheaper and faster. He called it The Menagerie. The editors were handed the original materials from the cage to cut from. They went through the footage, pulled the scenes they needed for the menagerie, and when they were done, they threw away the pieces they did not use. Here is the thing. They thought they were working with a copy, a print. Standard procedure was that editors would receive a copy of the original negative to work from, and the original would be stored safely somewhere else. But someone made a mistake. A catastrophic, irreversible mistake. The editors had been given the original camera negative of The Cage, not a copy, the actual original, and they cut it apart, and they threw away whatever they did not need. The original Star Trek pilot, the most expensive television pilot Desilu had ever made, the real version of the show Gene Roddenberry had actually wanted to make, was physically destroyed by accident by the people who were supposed to preserve it. When Roddenberry found out what had happened, the only version left was a rough, black and white 16mm reference print he had made for himself. Not for distribution, not for preservation. Just a working copy he kept at home to review scenes during production. That rough, black and white print was the only complete version of The Cage that existed for the next 20 years. Roddenberry would show it at Star Trek conventions throughout the 1970s. Fans would sit in darkened rooms watching a slightly blurry black and white version of a pilot that had never aired, projected on a sheet, understanding they were seeing something that officially did not exist anymore. Then in 1986, to celebrate Star Trek's 20th anniversary, Paramount released The Cage on home video, a VHS tape. But because the color negative was gone, they had to do something strange. The scenes that had been used in the menagerie still existed in color. The scenes that had been cut and thrown away only existed in Roddenberry's black and white print, so the VHS release switched back and forth, color for some scenes, black and white for others, depending on whether the footage had survived. People bought that tape and watched a pilot that jumped between color and black and white because half of the original had been destroyed 20 years earlier. And then something happened that nobody expected. In 1987, a film archivist named Bob Furmanek was going through old unclaimed material at a Hollywood film laboratory, boxes and cans of old footage that nobody had touched in years. Material that was sitting in a vault waiting to be cleared out and destroyed. He found a rusty, unmarked can of 35mm film. He opened it. Inside were the missing color negative trims from The Cage, the scenes that had not been used in The Menagerie. The footage that everyone had assumed was gone forever. Sitting in an unmarked can in a vault, scheduled for destruction for 21 years. Furmanek recognized what he had. He got it back to Paramount immediately. The full-color Star Trek pilot was restored and broadcast on television for the first time in 1988, 23 years after it was made. 1 week away from being thrown away forever. 1 week. Now here is where it gets even stranger. Because before NBC even saw The Cage, someone else had already passed on it. Gene Roddenberry took the pilot to CBS first. CBS had a first refusal agreement with Desilu Studios, which meant they got to see new projects before anyone else. CBS watched The Cage, and they said no. But here is what makes that almost unbearable. CBS did not just say no to Star Trek that day. They said yes to something else. a different science fiction show. A space show they felt was more accessible, more fun, more appropriate for a mainstream audience. That show was Lost in Space. CBS chose Lost in Space over Star Trek, flying saucers and a robot waving its arms over the show that would eventually become one of the greatest franchises in human history. And after CBS passed, after NBC rejected The Cage and demanded a second pilot, there was still one more moment where the whole thing could have died. Desilu Studios was run by Lucille Ball. Yes, that Lucille Ball. I Love Lucy, the most famous comedian in America. She owned the studio and she had the final say over what it funded. Her board of directors looked at the cost of a second Star Trek pilot and told her not to do it. Too much money, too risky. The first one had already been rejected. Cut your losses, walk away. Lucille Ball overruled her entire board of directors and personally funded the second Star Trek pilot. She was not a Star Trek fan. She did not love science fiction. She just knew good television, and she believed the show deserved another chance. That is the only reason it got one. Here is the full picture. CBS passed on The Cage and chose Lost in Space instead. NBC rejected The Cage as too cerebral and accidentally had the original negative destroyed. The only surviving version was a rough black and white print that Roddenberry screened at conventions for 20 years. A film archivist found the color footage in a rusty, unmarked can 1 week before it was scheduled for destruction. And the franchise only survived its darkest moment because a comedy legend overruled her own board of directors on a hunch. And here is the final piece. The characters from The Cage. Captain Pike, number 1, the whole darker, more philosophical version of Star Trek that NBC said audiences were not ready for in 1965. Those characters are now the stars of Strange New Worlds, the most critically acclaimed Star Trek series in 20 years. A show that critics in 2022 called the best thing Trek has done in a generation. It took 57 years, but the show NBC called too cerebral finally got made. The thing they buried in 1965 turned out to be the thing worth building toward all along. Here is what stays with me. Every time someone says an idea is too complex, too slow, too much for the audience, there is a real chance they are just saying the audience has not caught up yet. NBC was not wrong that The Cage was different. They were wrong that different meant bad. They wanted something simpler, and they got one of the most successful franchises in human history. But the original thing, the cerebral thing, the thing they said was too much, that survived in a rusty can, and 57 years later, the world finally caught up to it. The best ideas often look wrong the first time. The ones that last are the ones somebody refused to throw away. Bob Furmanek opened that can 1 week before the deadline. 1 week. And the real Star Trek survived. So here's your question for the comments. The Cage, the dark philosophical pilot with Pike in number 1, versus the action-driven Kirk era that actually made it to air. Which version of Star Trek do you think would have built a bigger franchise if NBC had said yes the first time? Comment down below. If this gave you something you did not know before, hit like and subscribe. We cover the versions of these shows they did not want you to see every week. The best stuff is always what almost did not survive.